secret, they wouldn't have been able to walk around and go, look what we got.
Yeah, right.
So for a couple of hundred years, there's no indication of this anywhere. The first image of Jesus with the split forked beard, longer hair, looking like the man on the shroud, came out at about 285 AD in a catacomb in Rome. And that's the oldest known depiction of Jesus the way we see him, on the shroud or in modern Renaissance artworks. And prior to that, Jesus had always been depicted more in the Roman style, bald head with a laurel wreath or something more Caesar-like,
Yeah, right.
After 285 AD, we start getting religious icons and depictions of Jesus that look like the man on the shroud. And so I think where was the shroud for the first few hundred years? Well hidden, I'm sure. But well protected because, probably passed on as a secret family treasure by whoever it was that kept it. There's no record of that, and we don't know. But I think that explains why, A, there's not much mention of anything like it in the Gospels, why there's no mention of an image, although some people believe some of the Gospels do have clues to the image of the shroud, but don't refer to it that way specifically.
Right.
Again, that could be true, and that could be because of the fear of owning something that was illegal to own and putting themselves and their families at risk. It's just speculation because we don't have a day-by-day, year-by-year, century-by-century documented history of the shroud as we know it today.
Right.
So it's always going to remain controversial, but there are expert historians who have drawn connections between these descriptions of earlier plots that were basically describing the same thing we call the Shroud of Turin.
Wow. Now that is quite impressive.
I'm Jewish.
Yeah.
So I certainly didn't come into this with any Christian bias for it. Certainly I had a bias against it. But the evidence is pretty much overwhelming that the cloth known as the Shroud of Turin wrapped a scourged, crucified, speared, and crowned human being, male. First century Semitic, and that's the other thing. The shroud is consistent with first century Jewish burial custom. So it's very important to note that there's nothing about the shroud that conflicts with anything written in the Old or New Testament.
Gotcha. So how about the man on the shroud? What does he actually look like? Does he look like the Jesus we typically present today?
Sort of, yeah. Yeah. Have you now you've seen it?
Yes. Oh, yes, definitely.
You've seen it. Okay, so you're asking me this question from the standpoint of somebody who's never seen it before.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, well, then the answer is go to shroud.com.
Yeah, right.
The answer.
Yeah.
You can see it on the Examine the Shroud page. You can look at it, and that's the way to see it. But basically what it looks like is, first of all, the shroud, when you first glance at it, it's quite confusing to the eye because in 1532, it was severely damaged in a fire in Chambray, France. And it was kept in a casket that was damaged, and fire got in, and it burnt holes into the shroud that form a pattern, interestingly enough, that act as kind of a border to the image. They run the entire length of the shroud, these burn holes and scorch marks, and they run pretty much the full length of the shroud, but they basically are outside of the body image area, except in the shoulders. Some of the shoulder image area was damaged by the 1532 fire. So when you first look at it, in 1534 they repaired it, they sewed in some patches, they sewed on a backing cloth, and so when you first look at it, the darkest thing you see are all these burns and scorches down the side of the image, making it more confusing to the inexperienced eye. When you look at it, you go, well, what is all that?
Yeah, right.
So the interesting thing is, of course, that the image is very subtle on the shroud. It's not an obvious image. The scourges and burn marks and things, rather, the burns and scorches are darker than the image, which is quite faint.
Yes.
And at arm's length, it's almost impossible to know exactly what you're looking at unless you're really familiar with it. And in 78, when we examined it, we found ourselves stepping away, 8-10 feet away from it to kind of reorient our eyes as to what exactly that area is that we're looking at.
Yeah, right.
So it's a very subtle image. And more interestingly, maybe, is that the image is not typical of an image artist would paint or a photographer would make, because we're used to seeing light highlights,
Right.
dark shadows. That's the natural way we see things. The image on the shroud is inverse of that. The highlights are dark, and the shadow, what would be considered a shadowed area, is faint. So it's just the inverse. And what that tells us is that the image on the shroud has one property, particularly, like a photographic negative. The lights and darks are reversed from what we normally see. That's a pretty strong argument that some medieval guy couldn't have created this, because his first task then would have been to invent photography.
Right.
So the shroud is not a photographic image. It has a property similar to a photographic negative. And this has created a lot of confusion, because people say, well, it's the first negative, it's the first photograph. Well, it has a property or two like a photographic negative. It does. But it also has properties so unlike a photographic negative as to make photography impossible as the mechanism for creating the image. I would know about that. That is my expertise. I've been a professional photographer for almost 40 years now.
Saw your website. Yeah.
And so I can attest to that based on my expertise in this field, which is my field of expertise, that the shroud image, although it has certain properties like a photographic negative, is not made by photography.
Cool.
Okay? And that's an important statement, because that's a very confusing statement at times, because some people, compare it to the first photographic negative, which in some respects would be okay to say, but then that gives the extra ammunition to the skeptics who want to claim that Leonardo da Vinci made it with a camera obscura. There's only one problem. The shroud is documented in the historic record 100 years before Leonardo was born. Now, he was a good artist, but he wasn't that good.
Right.
And so, and look, when it was burned in the fire in 1532, it had been stored in a silver and wood casket. There was some thought that the silver of that casket, when the fire struck it, might have started to melt and drip molten silver onto the cloth. And that was one of the theories. So when our team went to examine it, we took with us certain types of spectral analysis, pyrolysis, mass spectrometry, and other types of analysis. And one of the elements that we looked for was silver, because in case the molten silver of the casket had melted on there, there would be some silver residue somewhere on the shroud, and we could have confirmed or denied that particular fact.
Right.
Well, guess what? There's another reason that whole set of experiments is important, because years later, when somebody claimed Leonardo made it with a camera obscura using a photographic emulsion, what is the primary ingredient of every photographic emulsion ever made on this planet? There's only one element in the periodic table that has the light-sensitive properties necessary to make a photograph, and that's silver. Well, guess what? Our team, with the most sensitive instruments that we had, found zero silver on the shroud, either in the burn marks or anywhere